We work in this tribunal with an international organizing committee meeting each 2 months in Paris. And this organizing committee have decided to have the 4 sessions that we have till now. The first one in Barcelona, the second one in London, the third one in Cape Town in South Africa, and this fourth one here in New York. After this 4th session, we will have a last session in Brussels, where we will, with all the members of the jury, make the global conclusion of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine, and from there, we will assume the distribution of all this conclusion all over the world. And you can help us to distribute and to make sure that what we have built together as conclusion and from Barcelona till New York will be known by a maximum of people, citizens, having the capacity to support the idea that human rights, international law, humanitarian law must be respected essentially today for the Palestinian people, but also all over the world. To do our job, we have a very nice jury. You can see around the table here the 11 members of the jury, and they will make their duty to be sure that we can reach the conclusion that we need to denounce the complicity of the American state of America in their support to the occupation by Israel, the occupation of Palestine, the colonization, and all these different aspects of the violation of the international law. We have also, at this table, 4 prominent lawyers. These different lawyers, they have accepted, some of them from the beginning of our work, they have accepted to make sure that we are working in a real legal framework. And I must thank them because they work a lot and months before the session to be sure that we have all the elements that we need to build the conclusion of this session of the tribunal. Professor Eric David, thank you very much to you. Eric David started with us from the beginning, and today he's here with Bina Hashmat, thanks to you, with Nurit Eckart. Hello, Nurit. And also with Professor Vincent Chapeau. All the 4 people that you see at this table, they will have the jury to go to the conclusion. And that's very important also. Having said that, in this room you have a lot of volunteers. And I cannot thank everybody for what they have done for the success of this session. But I must thank essentially, especially Miriam. Miriam, thank you very much for all what you do now from the last march. You work each day for the success of this session. Sherry and Antonia, thank you to you. And in London we have somebody having do a very beautiful work also, and he's the coordinator of the Russell Tribunal. He worked with me, and it's Frank Barat. And in Brussels, we have also somebody working each day for the success of all this process of the tribunal, and it's Virginie Van Averbeek. So, you see, it's a long process, it's a lot of work that we have done to reach this special session here in New York, and to be sure that we will have the capacity to succeed in our work. I tell you that I reserve two names. With Ken Coates, this tribunal was possible only because two women, two prominent women, start to send a message around the world saying the need for this kind of initiative. One of them is not here, it's Leila Shade, but the other is here. It's Nurit Pellet. Hello, Nurit, and thank you very much to be here. And now also, you remember that? That's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Not big, it's like that. That's the Human Declaration of Human Rights. And we have with us today the only survivor of the people having built this Human Rights Declaration. It's our chair of the jury, Stéphane Hessel. Please, Stéphane, you have the floor.
Citoyens et citoyennes, citizens, male and female, nous vous encourageons par votre présence dans cette belle salle au cœur de New York. Je vous parlerai en anglais parce que c'est quand même la langue la plus répandue dans cette région du monde. Mais réjouissons-nous que dans toutes les langues, dans 35 langues, le petit livre dans lequel j'ai essayé d'appeler les citoyens à se mobiliser pour les causes qui nous sont chères, ce petit a été distribué très largement. Cette session du tribunal Russell, merveilleusement introduit par mon vieil ami Pierre Galland, mais merveilleusement encouragé par ce que vient de nous dire le maire de Genève, it is a very special session. We are meeting at a time when the General Assembly of the United Nations is meeting in this city and is able to try to bring forward a better knowledge everywhere of the basic human principles and international law. We are privileged, you are all privileged, to live in a world that for over 60 years now has a United Nations where the basic principles are there. And that is a great thing for all of us. We can base our work on that and say, let us go forward. On the question of Palestine, it is not necessary to dwell. You all know how this unfortunate population has been abused and over-abused for the past 60 years, and with nobody to really be there to help it achieve at last the statehood that it deserves. What we want to do here, today and tomorrow, and the day after, is to make clear that not only the government of the United States, but the United Nations as a whole has not been able to do more than to draft resolutions, to say what should be done, and to do nothing that it can actually be done. We want to put a new impulse on the media particularly, and on all of you, each one of you, you can all help, so that this impossible situation and that this impunity that is reached to Israel, not only by the United Nations but by the United States, should find an end. If we achieve some progress in that, thanks to you being there listening to us, then the day will have been worth living. Thank you.
Exception. Before that I pass the floor to the chair of this part of the session, my duty is also to inform you that there is a resume of the previous session conclusion, so that you will find it in the entry, I believe. You can have it. That's from Barcelona and London, and this one is from Cape Town. Having speak about Cape Town, I pass now the floor to the two co-chairs of this session, and it is, on my right, Ronnie Castries and Miguel Angel Estrella. You have the floor and you chair this session.
This is on.
This is on, but you speak in the main.
Yeah, okay. We're going to chair this now. Yeah? So shall I begin? Well, thank you very much, Pierre. We're chasing time, given the delay, not the fault of the Russell Tribunal, but we need to get a move on. And the session now, your program's the introductory session, which was meant to start at 10:30. We're really at 11:10 or nearly 11:15 now. So without any further ado, we would like here with Miguel Angel Estrella to call on Ilan Pape, who will address the tribunal on the topic, the birth of Zionism and its impact on the Palestinians.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the Tribunal. Thank you all for attending this important event. It's very difficult to condense a historical analysis and transform it into an evidence. But I will try to do that by focusing on 5 bullet points. 5 points from the past that I think are still very relevant for the present, and understanding them well probably will impact our ability to engage with the future. And I bring them as part of a knowledge that I think has to be integrated into any attempt to judge, understand, and hopefully suggest a solution for the troubled land in which I was born and in which I still try and live. The first point is about the impact of early Zionism on Palestine, which I think has to be taken into account of any analysis of the present. As you probably know, Zionism began as a noble movement that had 2 impulses that one can understand. The impulse to find security for Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, and a wish to redefine Judaism as nationalism, as so many other religious and cultural groups did in the mid of the 19th century. The problem with that noble movement was when it decided that the only territory where it can implement these two impulses was a land already inhabited by other people, the land of Palestine. The Zionist fallacy or mythology that Palestine was a land without people, waiting for the people without land, has already successfully been challenged by professional historiography. But I think it's still somehow not accepted by everyone with a power to impact the reality in Israel and Palestine. It is very important to understand that Zionism appeared as a late-day colonialism in Palestine. Now, it was not only a colonialist movement that appeared later than most other colonialist movements. It is also a colonialist movement that appeared in a region where colonialism was not very successful. The only place that was properly colonized was Algeria. And there, the people of Algeria, as you know, resisted, eventually in a successful way, the French colonization of Algeria. It was not to be expected that the Palestinians would react differently to the idea that someone can come and colonize their country at an age and time where colonialism was already understood to be a power or force that undermines and ruins native societies into which it landed and into which it entered. So I think the first point, and a very important point, is to understand that Palestine was a thriving place, a thriving society when Zionism entered the land. And it is good to play a little bit with alternative history and understand that had Zionism not arrived in Palestine, there was a good chance that the Palestinian society, like any other Arab society, would have developed on a similar way, from a nation state to a force for liberation and a place that has a history and identity which was mostly Arab, Islamic, and Middle Eastern. And all these features that are still characterize other Arab countries have been lost in the case of Palestine. The second point I would like to make is about the basic attitudes of early Zionists towards the native indigenous population of Palestine. What is important to understand is that these basic attitudes and perceptions of the natives have not changed, and they still inform most of the Israeli Jews' attitudes towards the Palestinians wherever they are, whether we are talking about politicians, generals, academics, or common people. These perceptions that were formulated at the very beginning of Zionism are still a very important part of the attitude today that is behind Israeli policies in the occupied territories towards the Palestinian minority and towards the question of the refugees. Now, these first impressions were that the Palestinians were foreign aliens present in a country that waited to be redeemed by the Jewish people. The early settlers, who were obsessive diarists, and nothing escaped their diary, not one mosquito bite, and have not ceased to write about the people who hosted them when they first came to Palestine, the people who gave them shelter, the people who taught them for the first time how to cultivate land. They did not forget to mention that these very people were usurpers, were aliens who overtook or took over something that belonged to the Jewish people 2,000 years ago. The idea of an alien native is very peculiar to the Zionist movement and is at the heart of the Zionist and Israeli policies towards the Palestinians. The third point I would like to make is that Zionism in the mandatory period between 1918 and 1948 had failed in two respects, although it had many, many impressive successes. It failed demographically and it failed geographically. Demographically, it failed because the basic impulse of Zionism was to create a democratic society, but at the same time a Jewish society. Hence, in order for the democracy to be valid, what you needed was a solid or even exclusive Jewish majority. In order to get a Jewish majority, you needed to bring as many Jews as you could to Palestine and to find ways of getting rid of the Palestinians on the other hand. When the British have left Palestine in 1948, only 1/3 of the population were Jews in Palestine. There was one failure from a Zionist perspective. The second failure was geographical. The Zionist movement tried to buy and purchase land to create a Jewish state. By the end of the British mandate, it succeeded in buying only 7% of the land of Palestine. The inevitable result of these two failures was the decision in February 1947 by the Zionist movement to ethnically cleanse Palestine. And as we are within a framework of a tribunal, which has a legal orientation, let me remind the ladies and gentlemen of the tribunal that ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity. It's a crime against humanity that only genocide is above it. It is a precise act by one movement of ethnic origin against another. And if you go to the State Department website, to its legal side, you will see a very clear definition of what are the origins of ethnic cleansing, what are the characteristics of ethnic cleansing, and what are the inevitable results of ethnic cleansing. And you will see that the case study of Zionism and Palestine in 1948 fit like a hand to a glove in this respect. I would remind us all in this respect that the Israeli narrative today about that particular period is that whatever happened to the Palestinians, and that includes even Israelis who feel some compassion towards the catastrophe that befell the Palestinian people, the main claim, which unfortunately some Palestinians even accept, is that the Palestinian leadership is responsible for the catastrophe. Had the Palestinians accepted the United Nations petition resolution, then the ethnic cleansing would have been prevented. This very immoral judgment has to be challenged at least on two bases. One is that before the Arab world decided to use force in order to reject the petition planned by the United Nations, namely before the 15th of May 1948, and before it was clear what are the positions of the sides because the United Nations deliberation on Palestine continued, before these deliberations ended, already half of the Palestinians became refugees. Namely, the Zionist plan to dispossess the Palestinians had nothing to do with the Palestinian position on the partition plan. The idea to dispossess Palestine, to de-Arabize Palestine, was there from the 1930s and was implemented long before it was clear what would be the Palestinian position on partition or what would be the United Nations ideas of peace. Secondly, even the argument that saying that if the Palestinian leadership rejected partition, which is understandable, because the Algerians would have rejected the partition of Algeria between themselves and the French settlers, even if the argument is that the rejecting the partition was wrong, it cannot be punished by the destruction of half of Palestine's villages, by the destruction of half of Palestine's cities, and by the expulsion of half of Palestine's population. Nothing justifies such an inhuman barbarity. Definitely not a political decision to ask that wanted the international community to reconsider the idea of a solution because most of the Palestinians and most of the people who lived in the Arab world did not like the idea of partition. So I think it's important not to fall into the trap when these historical facts are being brought about as if they justify anything that Israel did, and I repeat my assertion that what they did was an ethnic cleansing operation, which is a crime against humanity. The fourth point I would like to make is that we should not forget in such a tribunal what the Palestinian community inside Israel has undergone, especially in the period 1948 to 1966, when it was subjected to a policy of mandatory emergency regulations that restricted every human and civil right that that Palestinian minority had. It's important to understand that historical period between 1948 to 1966, because the very same military regime that was imposed on 1/5 of the Israeli citizens was transplanted into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967. When you see the history in one go, or as a complete picture, you understand that since the fragmentation of the Palestinian people to different geopolitical groups inside Israel, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, in the refugee camps, and in the exilic communities, you understand that Israel does not always deal directly with each of that group. And not always the same group constitutes, in the eyes of the Israelis, a danger to the existence of Israel. So the power of Israel is transferred from one Palestinian group to the other in 1967. And the Israelis had ready-made mechanism which has violated already then, when it was imposed inside Israel, every international convention, every human right and civil right idea. So the Jewish state, in many ways, is a long history of systematic violation of human rights and civil rights, not just its policy towards the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and I hope we are not going to forget this in this important tribunal. And finally, I would like to explain again the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, because there is a tendency, a very natural tendency, to look at the history of the occupation as if it is not part of a longer history of colonization and dispossession, as if really everything until 1967 was fine and lighted and does not deserve our attention. In fact, I don't think we can understand the Israeli policies in 1967 and after 1967 if we don't take a longer historical view on these events. The Israeli political and military leadership of 1948 regretted the fact that it had not occupied the West Bank in that year and had not ceased to dream about the annexation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to Israel in order to make the Jewish state, in their eyes, a more viable strategic unit and a more viable moral unit, namely redeeming the very ancient heartland of the Jewish people, which were in the West Bank, not inside Israel. The main establishment of the army, of the political elite, has never given up the idea of creating a greater Israel between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean. What they were looking for was the historical opportunity. And few times before 1967, they already thought the opportunity was there, but it did not materialize. It materialized in 1967. And when it materialized in 1967, what the Israeli political elite decided then and there is something that no subsequent Israeli government has ever deviated from. And I think we were all, some of us, were fallen into the trap to think, in thinking, that there was a new Israeli thought about peace, about reconciliation, about justice that emerged after 1967. This is not true. This is absolutely not true. In 1967, the most consensual Israeli government ever, that included every political party in Israel in 1967, decided or took 3 decisions which are with us, and with this I would end, and I think have to be understood and would cast a question mark about ideas such as occupation, the peace process, and a 2-state solution. And the three decisions are the following. Maybe there was a preliminary decision I would like just to mention, which is only Israel is going to decide the fate of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The rest will accept or reject an Israeli ideas of how best to deal with these territories. There is no agency for anyone else, not for an international mediator, not for the Palestinian or the Arab world. Israel will decide what is the best idea to deal with the new territories, new Palestinian territories it had occupied in June '67. That was a preliminary decision. The first decision was that the Palestinian population of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip would not be ethnically cleansed as the Palestinians of 80% of Palestine were ethnically cleansed in 1948. In these 20% of Palestine that Israel occupied in 1967, the Palestinians were allowed to stay. It was an Israeli decision. It was not a successful struggle against a policy of expulsion. It was a decision not to expel. Maybe it would have failed, I don't know. But they decided not to expel. And they had a serious discussion about the possibility of ethnically cleansing Palestine once more. That is, the 20% of Palestine that were not expelled, were not occupied in 1948. The second decision was that these territories cannot be in de jure annexed to the State of Israel. That you cannot officially annex these areas. Because if you annex them officially, you are, unlike in 1948, are going to encounter international rejection. And the same policy, and we forgot about it, Israel annexed in 1950, in sheer violation of international law, the parts of the United Nations partition resolutions that were allocated to the Palestinians in November 1947. In 1950, quietly, through the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, the Israelis annexed these territories that belonged, according to the international community, to the Palestinian people. And they learned the lesson then, that if the international community is silent about the ethnic cleansing of 1948, it would be silent about the annexation of the Arab territories into the State of Israel, and they would be silent about the de facto annexation of the West Bank into Israel. Israel was never interested in the Gaza Strip as such. So the main focus was on the West Bank. The last decision that was taken was that if you do not expel the people and you do not annex officially the territories, you have to decide what would be the status of the people there. And there and then in 1967 fell the decision to create something which we have never seen anywhere else in modern history. The idea of citizenless citizens in a mega prison that was built in 1967. That mega prison, as you can see today, has two versions. One version is a maximum security facility, when the Palestinians reject the Israeli rule, when they resist by force or by non-violent means the occupation, then they are being punished with the kind of forms of maximum security prisons we have seen in 1987, in 2002, and we are watching today in the siege and ghettoizing of Gaza. So that's one model. The other model is the one that attracted the world's attention and produced a lot of scholarship and a lot of support. That's the idea of the open prison. The open prison is a gift given by the Israelis to the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, should they behave according to the Israelis' ideas of reconciliation. And when they accept it, they can have autonomous life. And the idea of autonomy develops in the 1980s into the idea of an Bantustan, a mini-state. We always have to remember the idea of two states is a Zionist idea. No normal Palestinian would ever suggest to divide his or her homeland into two states. That doesn't stand to reason altogether. It's unfortunate that a lot of our good friends, some of them are here, I'm sure, are still supporting this as a paradigm for peace. And I think this is false. This is wrong. And with this, I would end and ask and beseech the Tribunal, do not shrink Palestine into 20% of its geography and do not shrink the Palestinian people into 50% of who they are. If we are going to seek a just and peaceful solution to the raging conflict there, we should include everyone who is affected and who was affected so that we can build together a stable future. Thank you.
May I remember the rules, please?
I'd really like to thank Professor Ilan Pape. There's much we can thank him for, but to thank him for being so succinct. Ilan, you were very quick and dealt with this in 20 minutes and have given us a little bit of time. We'll come to some questions now. I'll ask you to do your best to respond to us. I'd like to raise a question and ask you for a comment, in fact. The noted British historian who's just died, Eric Hobsbawm, I'm sure you know well. It was very sad that he expired the other day. But he made a very noted statement about history. It was widely quoted in the British papers. The business of historians is to tell people about what has been forgotten. Business of historians to tell people about what has been forgotten. You belong to an exceptional group of historians, the new historians in Israel, who have produced a narrative that has turned Zionism absolutely upside down, created big problems for the Zionist narrative. What I'd like to ask you is, in your opinion, how far do you believe that telling the right story, which you're trying to do with many other outstanding both Palestinian and Israeli historians, how far this is making headway with the Israeli people, but for us here in this setting, for the American public and for the United Nations, because clearly it's extremely important that here in the United States, key supporter of Israel, that we've managed to turn around the thinking which you so well present, and the opportunities with the United Nations as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. I think in this I take my lead from the late Edward Said, who in 1982 wrote a brilliant article called The Permission to Narrate. And I think what he wanted us to believe in, and I think it's part of his legacy, was that even if you are disempowered, politically, economically, or militarily, nobody can rob you of your right to tell your history the way you want to tell it. And that maintaining that right is a powerful tool that eventually may also redress the other balance, the economic balance, the military balance, and the diplomatic balance. And therefore, I do think that hearing a different narrative, a different version of events, which clearly shows where criminality and inhumanity was taking place, which clearly points to who were the criminals, who were the perpetrators, and does not evade issues of morality and ethical dimension, eventually makes its ways indirectly to the way politicians, journalists, and the common public relates to the issue of Palestine. You know, the main problem, Ronnie, in Palestine is that daily events in Palestine are not catastrophic enough for mainstream media. The only way the mainstream media understand that it's facing a criminality is when it takes an accumulative perspective. And for taking that accumulative perspective, in order to understand the magnitude of the Israeli inhuman policies towards the Palestinians, you need that historical perspective. So I'm a great believer in it.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to raise a question?
Bonjour.
Je viens d'Argentine et la question de la dépossession.
Sorry, my French isn't that good. I want to understand perfectly. What do I do with this?
De la dépossession jusqu'à l'occupation.
Okay.
Et moi, ça m'a pris longtemps pour le comprendre. Et comme une grande partie de l'humanité, adolescent, dans les années 50, je participais à tous les combats qui défendaient l'histoire du peuple juif. Et la plupart des musiciens de l'orchestre de ma ville natale à Tucumán venaient d'échapper et faisaient partie de cette énorme diaspora juive qui est arrivée en Argentine. Alors, j'ai participé à tout ça, convaincu, etc. Et même quand j'avais 20 ans, ma femme et moi, on avait choisi dans notre entourage une mère juive, une femme de Pologne qui vit toujours et qui était notre mère juive, pour nous chrétiens, ma femme et moi. Alors, ça nous a pris très longtemps. Pour moi, c'était en 88, pour la première fois de ma vie, je suis allé jouer en Moyen-Orient, entre autres dans des villes palestiniennes. Et j'ai eu accès à visiter un camp de Palestiniens. C'était le Ramadan de 88, et bouleversant pour moi, parce que c'est à partir de ce moment-là que j'ai compris ce que c'était non seulement la dépossession, mais l'occupation. Alors, quand j'ai visité ces camps palestiniens, j'ai voulu parler surtout à des jeunes couples palestiniens qui avaient énormément d'enfants. Et je leur posais la même question à tous. Que faites-vous devant cette humiliation de la dépossession et l'occupation? Alors la réponse était toujours la même. Nous font des enfants et un jour nous serons plus nombreux. Chose qui m'a effrayé, vraiment ça m'a effrayé. Quand je suis rentré de cette tournée, j'étais complètement habité par l'idée d'un orchestre, de chrétiens arabes, de juifs et des musulmans du monde arabe, un orchestre pour la paix. Alors, en même temps, Arafat, Shimon Peres et Rabin recevaient le prix des constructeurs de la paix de l'UNESCO. Cette même UNESCO qui a décidé cette année de reconnaître l'État palestinien. Il a fallu ramer beaucoup, parce que l'information, en plus, les médias sont des responsables aussi du manque d'information pour que l'ensemble de la population mondiale comprenne ce que c'est l'humiliation de la dépossession et de l'occupation. Alors, j'avais eu droit, Dieu merci, à un entretien avec Shimon Peres, Rabin et Arafat, et quand je leur ai posé la question de l'Orchestre pour la paix, Arafat a réagi immédiatement en me disant « ça serait un miracle, si tu peux le faire, c'est bravo, chapeau, mais il va être très difficile pour toi, figure-toi, si tu vas en Irak, tu ne pourras pas dire le mot juif, tu ne pourras pas dire le mot Israël, tu ne pourras pas dire le mot shalom. Alors, parle toujours des enfants d'Abraham. C'est comme ça que j'ai pu construire cet orchestre avec les enfants d'Abraham. Bon, il y a beaucoup d'autres choses à dire, mais le temps paraît-il, est contraire à...
It's another testimony. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
No. Do you have a comment on that?
I think it wasn't a question. I think it
sure.
was a comment.
But very interesting anecdote.
Yeah,
Thanks.
very interesting.
We do have a question from Mike Mansfield here.
Yeah, here's a question. And the question is directed to the way forward, which is one part of these sessions. I appeared before CERD, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, in Geneva earlier this year, where the committee pointed out to Israel that it had failed to comply with pretty well any of its recommendations over the past decade. And one of the delegates made this point, and I'd like your observations on this, that the existence of Israel had a precondition, and the precondition was that it would in fact institute a pluralist society in which equal rights were accorded to all. That was the intention. And of course we know what happened is that the Declaration of Independence by Israel and the Basic Law of Israel does no such thing. In fact, there is no mention of Palestine or the Palestinians in their Basic Law, and certainly no according of equal rights. Now, with a state that is refusing dogmatically to make any changes to Basic Law, how do we progress this matter towards an equitable solution?
Yes, thank you. I think, first of all, you're right. Historically, I think the United Nations Resolution 181, which is popularly known as the Partition Resolution, assumed that equal rights would be granted to the Jewish inhabitants who would be in the Arab state and the Palestinian inhabitants who would be part of the Jewish state. But by the time that resolution became part of the official policy of the United Nations, Israel has already violated that very promise by expelling by force the Palestinians from most of the areas that became the Jewish state, and by imposing on the very few that were allowed to stay a military rule. And I think when you are born in a sin, in a way, you find it very difficult to get rid of it. Now, as for the future, how do you deal with it? Well, one has to understand that for most Israeli politicians, pundits, and public, international law is tantamount to anti-Semitism as an attitude of the international community, forgetting, of course, that the most important contribution to that law were the result of the international community's abhorrence with the Holocaust in Europe. So I don't think that one should give up pointing to the Israelis where they violate the international law, but one should not expect that just by doing that you will succeed in changing the Israeli basic attitudes towards the Palestinians. I think that acknowledging the violation is one thing. Forcing the violator to be accountable for that violation is far more important. Now, the international community does not have to invent any new wheels. We have clear, non-violent means in our capacity as international communities, as national communities, to exert pressure on the Israelis to begin at least obeying some of their international commitments, not all of them. And I think that so far the political and economic elites, especially of the West, are either afraid or unwilling to do it. But I think that one cannot escape the conclusion that it's not just the analysis of the violation that is important, but also the prognosis of how to stop it from the outside, which is very crucial to what we should do in the future.
Okay, thank you so much. There's a time for one short question from the tribunal members. One more question if anybody would like to raise one. Stefan?
I am very grateful to Ilan Pape. I wanted to ask him, do you have the feeling that the knowledge within Israel of the historical realities that you have brought forward is making some progress? We have, of course, friends in Israel who feel exactly like you, but up to now they're a very small minority. Do you have the feeling that what you are bringing and some other modern historians, is making some progress in the minds, particularly of Israeli youth, and perhaps particularly in the minds of Israeli soldiers. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid the two questions are connected. The question of analyzing what should be done and how far can the Israeli society transform from within, including through a better understanding of the historical facts and historical past. And I think that there are the beginnings of change among the younger generation in understanding. I'm troubled, however, by two aspects of this change. One is, of course, that it's a very slow change, and education is a far slower process than any other process of human transformation we know about. You have to deprogram people in order to make them open-minded enough to accept an unpleasant past. And not everybody likes to look at the mirror and see an unpleasant figure there. The second aspect, which is even more troubling to my mind, is that while we started the debate in Israel, the debate was factual. Do we tell the truth or don't we tell the truth? This is gone. We're not debating the debates anymore, the facts anymore. We are debating their morality. And a large section of young Israelis believe that expelling the Palestinians in 1948, imposing military regime on the Palestinian minority inside Israel, and imposing a military rule and occupation and collective punishment and siege on the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is an ethical, accepted policy by the government. I have not seen demonstrations of any significant magnitude against the immorality or inhumanity of these policies, or in relations to the historical facts which I've mentioned. Which means that, like in some other cases in history, again, you need something more powerful to trigger a realization that what you are condoning, what you are complacent about, and what you support is rejected by most conscientious and decent people around the globe.
Thank you so much. We'd love to have you here longer. I would like to say that it's been extremely noted, Ilan, how brave you've been, and thank you. I'll hand to you to invite Mr.
Je pose la question.
No. We must invite people here to come behind the cooling. Okay. He's coming up.
Oui, sur le thème de l'implication des Nations Unies sur la question palestinienne depuis le mandat jusqu'à présent. Personnellement, comme dans beaucoup d'autres affaires, comme l'affaire de Malouine en Argentine, il y a un double standard dans les Nations Unies et dans beaucoup d'organisations mondiales du fait que certains pays ont droit à ne pas intervenir quand ça ne leur convient pas, et quand il s'agit des pays émergents, par exemple, par contre, la loi est cruelle et sans aucune sorte d'humanisme.
We're coming to the next witness. We'd like to call Mr. Peter Hansen. He will deal with the topic United Nations involvement in Palestine from the mandate to the present. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much. It's a very large topic I've been given. I would like to start out by saying that we are not always making very clear what we mean when we talk about the United Nations. We often refer to it as if it is a distinct subject, a unitary actor that can have motives and that can be blamed for what it does or what it doesn't do. But the UN is many things. As we've seen in New York here in the last week, it is very much a stage in which the politics are being played out, as it were, where other actors use this stage to interact in formulating their policies and deciding on whatever action they want to do individually or collectively. But the UN can also be an actor itself in certain instincts, and we do have to distinguish a bit between what we mean by the UN. I will just emphasize here that it is a conglomerate of fora, of networks and administrative structures, of governments, increasingly NGOs, experts, civil society, etc. Where each pursue their own interests. And as such, it becomes a bit difficult to share blame and praise for the UN when we are dealing with such a completely amorphous subject as we are. Of course, it's not all fragmentation and confusion. There is a unifying trend in the UN, namely it has its charter, which forms a basic framework for all of these activities, from which a fragmented system can draw its legitimacy. The charter sets out purposes, aspirations, principles of peace, justice, human rights development, which we have sometimes seen actively pursued and sometimes more observed in the breach. Instead of going through the history, and I'm not going to take you from the mandate to today, I would rather make a point of some 6 functions that the UN is performing in relation to Palestine, in relation to Palestine. But before taking them up, just to mention the mandate that I shall not spend time on, I think it's worthwhile mentioning that the concept of justice as being something that always flows from international universal organizations like the League or the UN is not necessarily something one should take without a very large grain of salt. In the mandate for Palestine, unlike all the other mandates, the cards were stacked against Palestine by having the Balfour Declaration written into it. So whereas other mandate areas of the League could go on fairly simply, not very simply, but they could go forward and have states formed, which was not really the case for Palestine, that already in the mandate had written into it, by the way, you have to make space for the Jews as a homeland. And that is one case in which the cards were stacked against Palestine from the very beginning. And when we look at the UN involvement in Palestine over it, the cards were stacked too. Elon made reference to the Resolution 181 and the distribution of land and population at the time. It was not a very fair deal that the Palestinians were offered. A great majority in their land were giving the smaller part of their territory, and the smaller group was given the larger part of the land. So one does have to bear that in mind when one concentrates. But the functions I would like to just mention is first, there are 6 functions. The first one is the United Nations as a source and generator of international norms and international law. Secondly, it has the function, to some extent, and I'll get into this, of implementing and seeing these norms realized and, if necessary, enforce them. A third function is adjudication, in interpreting the norms and deciding to what degree they are or not maintained and to what degree they should be. The fourth is a function of tracking what is going on in these areas, supervision and monitoring. The fifth one that I have been particularly engaged in as Commissioner General for UNRWA for 9 years is the operation of humanitarian activities. And finally, you have a vast array of activities concerned with development and institution building in Palestine. First of all, with regard to the normative functions, the General Assembly and its various subsidiary bodies have generated a vast body of international law, and let us single out and keep in the center the Human Rights Declaration, the Human Rights Covenants, the Convention on the Child, and various others. And we have the very important body of international humanitarian law that is not generated by the General Assembly, but the ICRC in Geneva. These complexes of laws and norms set essential standards for the accountability of action by member states and should set such standards for accountability in the occupied territories. After a first, if you will, normative activism with the Resolution 181, the partition resolution, and I should mention also Resolution 194 about the right of return. I think of this resolution as the birthright of Palestinian refugees. I have not been able to find a Palestinian child in a refugee camp who could not quote more of Resolution 194 and the rights that endowed them than a Danish child could quote from the Danish institution, or an American child could quote from theirs. That norm and that expression it has been given through the UN is something that is very, very defining for the identity and perception of the rights of Palestinians. At the same time, it's a norm and it's a principle that you don't bring up in polite discourse in Israel, and that you don't bring up in polite discourse anymore, even in the United Nations resolutions and negotiations. You can refer to relevant resolutions and so on and imply Resolution 194, but you don't even mention it anymore. It has gone so far out of use, almost as being seen as being illegitimate to quote as a basic right of the Palestinians. For a long time, there was a complete lull then in UN engagement with the issue. The Palestinian issue in the UN was basically reduced to a question of humanitarian issues. What do we do with the poor people? How do we feed them and give them tents and what have you for basic survival? And it took a war, namely the 1967 war, to bring the Palestinian issue back in any meaningful form in the UN. And here we again see a UN norm or UN decision being this time formulated and stated by the Security Council, namely a Resolution 242 with its Land for Peace edict setting the framework for all discussions about peace in the area. We have had Palestine now as a fixed agenda item for many years, since Resolution 3236 in '94 that established the right to self-determination, national independence, and sovereignty. And we've had an annual reconfirmation of these Palestinian rights. One might dismiss this as so much more paper going through the UN mill, but if we didn't have it, the Palestinian question might run the risk of the destiny it had from the founding of Israel until the '67 war, of being basically forgotten. Now, the activity in the UN on this takes part as a large number of UN resolutions on Palestine, every General Assembly, and it takes place in a series of meetings in the Security Council. So whereas the normative function works, the functions that should help implement these norms have been completely stalemated in the Security Council, and we all know that it has been the United States that has provided a great many vetoes to ensure that complete stalemating. I am not so sure sometimes that this is not sometimes convenient to the Europeans, that they can hide behind the United States and not come out and be counted when they are called upon, because the United States will do the blocking that is necessary in the Council. Then we come to the second function I mentioned, namely realizing these norms, translating them into agreements and into reality, negotiation, in other words. The UN was again very active in the early years with Bernadotte, who was murdered, as we all know, and Ralph Bunche, who succeeded in the armistice negotiations. But again, it very quickly became peripheral to the issue until really the Madrid conference in '91. This is again something that Ilan pointed to, Israel not accepting anybody but themselves to decide what the issues are and how they should be resolved. They can sometimes accept the United States, but other third parties or mediators are not really welcome. In Madrid, and after that in Oslo, then the peace process started, and many of us, I'm sure, even many were critical from the very beginning, were hopeful that this would lead to something, that we have seen a process of bargaining that would lead to some form of justice. I would take issue with that without having time to go into the substantive details of it, but I would like to emphasize that this has not been a process that has been guided by the first function of the UN, namely setting norms, standards, and values. This has very much been a matter of bargaining, horse trading, and making deals without very much attention to whether there was any realization of the justices, the principles, and the values that were expressed in the Charter or in the various resolutions. I don't think I'm speaking unduly negatively when I say that it has this process that is now more and more written in inverted commas, of course, and that's justified, has degenerated into an exercise in futility. And to the people watching this process for the, what is it, 22nd year or something like that, for these people and for the people in Palestine has become a cruel joke. And I can think of it only as a cruel joke every time I hear politicians in Europe and in the United States making great references to the process and trying to give people hope that this process is going to lead anywhere at all. There is always a tension, a built-in tension between my function number 1 and the function number 2. One is to be creating and guarding norms and values and principles. Another one is when you negotiate. How much do you let your negotiation be guided by these norms and values? How much can you compromise on norms and values and still have an acceptable tension between the two? I think a problem we are facing in the United Nations, and I would like to make that point with the example of the United Nations participation in the so-called quartet. Now, in the quartet, consisting of the US, of the European Union, of Russia, and the UN, as you probably all know, we have power brought together with legitimacy. At least that's how it was sold in the first instance. The UN brings the legitimacy to the table, and the US brings power. The Europeans bring money, and God knows what the Russians are bringing. But in this process, the test of that, I would think, is to look for evidence. Where did the UN affect an outcome that would make these negotiations more value-driven, more principle-driven, more even-handed? Look at that with a very large magnifying glass and every statement of the quartet, and I think you will come up disappointed. If you look at where US interests have been reflected very strongly, it has certainly not been in imposing or in insisting on principles of international law. It has been every time, again and again, to favor an Israeli position. And sometimes when one looks at these things, imagine that the US would go to quartet meetings with Israeli instructions on what the outcome should be. There certainly is not any balance. And it's difficult to talk balances between power and principles. You cannot be purely one or purely the other, but you have to be within certain bounds of respecting and being guided by principles in such a negotiation process. Now, much has been said about the quartets, but I'm afraid that even as good as the intentions might have been from the start, the image of the UN for impartiality, for concern and seriousness about its own norms, I think, have suffered very much from this participation. And one thing in the road forward is that whatever roadmaps and other things that the quartet has come up with, that is hardly the way forward if one wants to see the UN play a role as a framer with the values and the principles. Judicial, and I shall be faster with the last functions. Here the International Court of Justice has been relatively little used, but there is the very important advisory opinion from 2004, which is a major contribution in bringing principles of international law to bear upon the treatment of the question of Palestine anywhere. There is now a comprehensive principle statement that makes clear the illegality of settlements, of the duty to observe human rights and humanitarian law in the territories, and of course the question of the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention especially. Supervision and monitoring sounds bureaucratic and so on, but I want to mention it because if it weren't for organizations like the Human Rights Council, the much maligned one, we've had through that an institution of special rapporteurs on human rights. And one of the most illustrious, one of them is sitting on the table here, and I can recommend warmly to all of you to read as many of these reports as possible. I don't think there's a better compendium of the human rights situation in the territories than in the series of reports we have from the special rapporteurs on human rights. And then the collection, analysis, and dissemination of data. If we can paint a picture that should be compelling of the misery and the suffering of the Palestinians, that is very much because it is as well documented as it is by United Nations bodies in the area. And that's maybe to some a trivial function, but I think a very important one to keeping the eyes fixed on what is going on with an objective lens. And again, without being overly bureaucratic, there is an Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which I was very doubtful about in the beginning when it was established, but I have had reason to correct myself. Their analysis and checking the checkpoints and documenting the lack of mobility in the territories is a sine qua non to understand why there is such a terribly serious situation economically, socially, etc. Humanitarian, and again, that's a function, humanitarian operations, to which I have been particularly attached. UNRWA, the largest UN agency anywhere, 30,000 staff. Some almost 5 million Palestinians are registered with UNRWA. You cannot go anywhere in the world and see a larger UN presence than you do in the occupied territories. In Gaza, it is very, very strong. You can barely drive a kilometer without seeing an UNRWA school or an UNRWA clinic or anything. And no doubt, UNRWA has a lot of contributions that they have made in education, in health, in social affairs, again. But significant as these achievements are, shouldn't we stop and ask that should we only be dealing with the symptoms? Should we only be treating a cancer with a Band-Aid? Is humanitarian action not a substitute for what the UN has never been able to deliver, namely political solutions? And the UN, I'm afraid, comes up very short on that. My experience as head of this organization for these many years was that I was not supposed to talk about anything except how to get the trucks to the delivery places or get the school programs organized from year to year. Questions about the reasons behind the need for humanitarian assistance was not welcome, really, to be commented upon from my side or from the agency side in the larger donor community. They like to think that they have bought redemption. They, after all, give some money every year, so what else do you want us to do? And then UNRWA becomes a very, very bad excuse and a cover for non-action and an excuse for political passivity. Development, I shall not take the time to go into this whole issue of engagement and involvement of the UN organizations in this, but I would like to make the point that whatever the UN is delivering, food, education, and so on, all good and fine for the Palestinians. But what they really care about when they see UNRWA and when they deal with UNRWA and the other ones is that is a sign that there is international commitment. How insufficient and short in desirability it may be, it was more important, I felt, when I dealt with refugees, that I showed them respect, I showed them we cared, and we were not there only to feed the hungry. We were there to show that we were there with them, and that at least there were some in the international community who could show some solidarity with their fate and their suffering. Now, let me finish by saying I've very briefly run over these functions, and of course they're much more complex and so on than I've been able to do in a short time. But the first one I started out with, namely the normative one, is to me by far the most important. That is the one where the UN has been weakest and where there is a great deal of risk that the UN will not stand up to and not follow and not pursue as a guiding its own norms. Where the UN has been strongest in operations in the field, yeah, well, it's important, it's good, and you know, people are not starving and suffering quite as much as they would if we would have left it to Israel to fulfill its obligations as an occupying power under the Fourth Convention, which I have no idea at all that they would have taken very seriously, certainly not from what I've seen. But we need to find a better balance between these different functions of what the UN does and what the UN doesn't do, what the UN does well and what the UN does less well. We cannot generalize and we cannot give an assessment of good, bad, or indifferent, because, as I started out saying, the UN is a very complex set of institutions, and you cannot just simplify and oversimplify and call them by one assessment or the other. So I'm pleading for the UN to be a bit more balanced in activating, however that is done, its normative principled functions. Not participating anymore in the quartet would just be a little negative step to it, and maintaining, as much as there is no other alternative, its assistance to the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey.
Thanks very much, Peter Hansen. Just to quickly remark on your very strong language, the reference to the whole UN process vis-à-vis the Palestinians as having become a cruel joke. The fact that the United States plays this particular role, the fact that endless number of the resolutions are not implemented, that Israel is allowed to get away with impunity vis-à-vis the violations of Palestinian rights. The UN is losing credibility, and no peace-loving person, no rational person wants to see the UN in demise. We want to see the UN playing its role as it has in the past, as it did on Palestine and South Africa through the 70s, particularly when resolutions were passed on racism in relation to Israel practices. So everybody has the question how to put teeth into the UN. Reform of the system is needed, an end to the blocking veto which the US plays and other countries have played, etc. Otherwise it's the cruel joke. So your view on that, are we going to sit as a world population waiting for decade after decade, and we'll see the demise of this once august body? Or is it possible, and given the number of countries of the UN, we see it in the General Assembly and the way they vote, to be frustrated at the Security Council? What can be done? That is the key question. Is it possible?
I think, well, I think one thing that cannot be done is to reform the United Nations from within and change the mandates and change this and that in the way resolutions are adopted. Change can only come about by pressure upon the governments who call the shots in the United Nations. And that means having events like this won't do it all, but mobilizing public opinion to start asking questions of their governments. Why are we not recognizing Palestine? Why can't we not accept Palestinian membership of the United Nations and have these sorts of activist questions raised effectively. That means so much more than moving around the boxes on an organigram and so on that is going to get us absolutely nowhere, I'm sure. This is no easy prescription. It's very long, it's very tough, but I think you have seen significant change in the way in which the issue is perceived in public opinion in the Western world. It's a long haul, but if you take a 15-year perspective, you will see significant change has taken place. I don't want the Palestinians to wait for another 15 years until some of these resolutions are implemented, but certainly working along these lines would be a lot more promising than discussing how you could give teeth to resolutions and so on.
Thanks very much for such a clear-cut reply, and I'm sure that activists in the world would really welcome your encouragement. Two quick questions, one from John Dugard, and then I recognise Mike Mansfield as well. But keep it quick and the answer as well so that we can move on. Thank you. John?
Is this working?
Yes, it's on.
First of all, I would just like to say that while I was Special Rapporteur in the occupied Palestinian territory, there was one UN institution that was very credible and very popular, and that was UNRWA under the leadership of Peter Hansen. It was the most popular institution in the Palestinian territory, more popular than the Palestinian Authority itself. But my question relates to the quartet, which you have mentioned, because it seems that the United Nations has handed over the peace process entirely to the quartet. But the strange thing is that the quartet refuses to speak to Hamas, and the United Nations refuses to allow its special envoys and leaders to speak to Hamas. Two questions. Who is responsible for the decision not to speak to Hamas? And secondly, do you believe that peace can be achieved in the region without some overtures towards Hamas and without the United Nations through its representatives speaking to Hamas itself? Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I can be very brief on the first one because I really don't know. I have read Alvaro de Soto's internal paper. Kofi Annan's memoirs are just out these days, and I don't think any of them provide the clear answer. To my view, the UN was too over-eager to have a seat at the table no matter what. And that became the important thing. So we'll forget about the, that's unfair to say that. I don't think anybody in responsible situation in the UN ever said that. But certainly give less weight and priority to the normative side, to international law. On the second question.
Can a meaningful peace be achieved without talking to Hamas?
No, of course it can't. Where has peace ever been achieved where a very significant actor in the system is put outside? I mean, once upon a time, PLO could not be spoken to. Now they are monopolizing relations or trying to anyway. Take every negotiation in Central America, in Mozambique, Angola, and so on. Only when you let in and you talk to all the parties is there any prospect of the exercise being meaningful, and it is absolutely not meaningful to go on with this, excluding even communication with one significant party that cannot be ignored. Further ignoring it will only increase hostility towards the UN and increase the popularity of Hamas in the context as those who are standing upright.
Thank you. A quick one from you, Mark.
Yes, it'll be quick. Can you hear? Is it all right? The microphone.
Yes.
You mentioned the advisory opinion of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which is an apocryphal and classic watershed in this, and sets out the principles very clearly. I'm just going to read one paragraph. It's 160 in the judgment. Finally, the court is of the view that the United Nations, and especially the General Assembly and the Security Council, should consider what further action is required to bring to an end the illegal situation resulting from the construction of the wall and the associated regime. We all know they've done nothing. Now, this was an opinion that the UN requested from the ICJ. They give their opinion, they hand it back and say, you get on with this, and they don't. Now, it seems to me, in a nutshell, unless the United Nations itself is prepared to reform its procedures and abolish the veto for the 5 permanent members, and extend the Security Council's membership and democratize it, we're going to get nowhere, because public opinion will be vetoed by the US every single time.
Shortly again, I can't agree more, but doing away with the veto is not going to be simple as long as each veto holder has a veto against it. So, sorry about that.
Thank you. Okay. There actually is a silent way of clapping. But Angela, quick question from you.
Yes, just a very brief question. I appreciated your description of the frustrations you experienced in your role as the Under-Commissioner of the Undersecretary of Humanitarian Affairs and the Commissioner General of Relief and Works Agency. I appreciated your description of the frustrations you experienced and this tendency to substitute humanitarian action as important as it might be, but to use that as a substitute for political solutions. And I also appreciated your call to activists around the world to put pressure on our governments to recognize Palestine. Now, I'm wondering how, and I guess this question relates to John's, whether you think there are certain structures within the United Nations that would militate against these transformations, and how would activists most effectively focus their opposition? What kinds of structural changes might also be called for?
Thank you. The UN has a division on Palestinian rights, and they're doing their level best to motivate and mobilize public opinion. Small budget, 2 or 3 meetings around the world every year. That's not going to do much. But I have found, when I've seen the Human Rights Council and the Old Commission in action in Geneva, there's an extraordinary mobilization of NGOs and activists and so on, and I have no doubt that it has influence. If we could see the same sort of thing, I'm sure we'll never see it outside the meeting chambers of the Security Council. That would be one thing, but I don't think that's a way to go. It has to go through opening up, pressuring on national decision points. National decision points. And there I think it is quite encouraging that public opinion is changing, and I'm sure will continue to change. And I'm just hopeful it won't take forever before that change will be affecting the situation in the territories.
Only to say that we warmly welcome Mr. Harry Belafonte. You are welcome. You are welcome.
Just a quick word from my co-chair before we call.
It's not a question, c'est une réflexion du latino-américain que je suis. Comme vous savez, parmi les choses évoquées par Peter sur l'évolution du monde, de la planète, toute l'Amérique latine est derrière l'État palestinien. Nous avons tous voté pour. Et beaucoup de pays d'Amérique latine ont demandé le changement urgent du Conseil de sécurité. Entre autres l'Argentine, qui a été très présente dans les dernières réunions aux Nations Unies. La transformation de ces conseils de sécurité pour éviter qu'il y ait toujours des pays qui font ce qu'ils ont envie de faire et qui ont la possibilité de veto contre une immense majorité qui, dans le cas de la Palestine, soutient un État palestinien. Ce n'est pas une question, c'est une réflexion latino-américaine.
Thanks very much for the Latino reflection. We will now have a reflection or input from Mr. Ben White, a very well-known journalist and writer, activist as well, who will speak to us on Israeli policies since 1948. Mr. White, please. Oh, you're here.
I'll just begin by extending my thanks to the Russell Tribunal and to the jury, to everybody here today, and to everybody who's watching also around the world via the live stream. I have the slightly daunting task of trying to condense Israeli policies since 1948 into a short presentation, now with the added complication of it being the session before a slightly delayed lunch. So I'm going to try and be concise but also useful in what I'm going to be bringing to you all. I'm going to begin just by touching on a few elements of what it means for Israel to be defined as a Jewish state, and obviously specifically the implications of that for the Palestinian people. I wanted to begin that by pointing out the way in which in the very first few years of the state's establishment, key laws that were passed, particularly the law of return, the absentee property law and the citizenship law, were the sort of foundation stones for a regime of exclusion and were defining who was in and who was out in this new state. And those laws being instrumental in dispossessing the expelled Palestinians and obviously also opening up the borders of the state to Jews around the world. I think, as has been noted already during this session today, Israel doesn't have a formal constitution, and something has been mentioned of the basic laws that Israel has passed, which obviously kind of regulate various aspects of the state, like the role of the Knesset and the army and so forth. I just wanted to mention one basic law, the Basic Law Human Dignity and Liberty from 1992, which is a useful way of highlighting the disparity or the problematic nature of the relationship between Israel's identity as both Jewish and democratic. Because this basic law, while on the surface offering some sort of protection to minorities within the state, actually has an important qualifying clause within the basic law that effectively says those rights can be abrogated in the event that it is important to protect the nature of Israel as a Jewish state. Also just wanted to mention, for example, within the context of Israel's definition as a Jewish state and protecting that, the fact that a few years ago in 2007, it was revealed via the Prime Minister's office how the Shin Bet, the internal security within Israel, was openly talking about how they would, quote, thwart the activity of any group or individual seeking to harm the Jewish and democratic character of the State of Israel, even if such activity is sanctioned by the law. Okay, so the kind of, and that was you know, an open declaration that the Shin Bet was making. I also wanted to mention the role of parastate bodies like the Jewish National Fund, the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency, whose relationship with the state since 1948 has also been very important in being kind of part of the instruments of colonization and dispossession, and the way in which those bodies are delegated functions and responsibilities that would normally be part of the state's responsibility. But in Israel's case, those tasks are delegated to bodies that are constitutionally mandated to benefit only one group of people. I'm going to move on to looking at some specifics in terms of Israeli policies. And you'll notice, of course, that given the title, Israeli Policies since 1948, I have to address policies that have affected Palestinians in the 48 area, in pre-67 Israel's borders, Palestinian citizens, but also Israeli policies in the West Bank and Gaza too. And I'll just make a point now that I'll return to at the end, which is it's very important for us to see the ways in which, even when different legal mechanisms are being used, that the main focus of Israeli policies towards the Palestinians, whether they have citizenship or whether they are citizenship-less and under military rule in the West Bank and Gaza, the main focus of Israeli policies remains the same. Establish a regime that benefits one group at the expense of another, with regards to land and natural resources and other things. So, of course, after 1948, and we've already had mention of the Nakba already today, but after the ethnic cleansing that took place, bearing in mind, of course, that it was only the ethnic cleansing of 1948 that enabled the establishment of a Jewish majority in the first place. After that, a number of laws, some of which I've mentioned already, were used to further the expropriation of land from the Palestinian population, and not just the Palestinians who had been expelled, but also from Palestinians who had remained and become citizens, and effectively the transference of Palestinian-owned land into the hands of the state, sometimes via those organizations I mentioned, the parastate organizations. Quote-unquote abandoned Palestinian property was given over for the establishment of new Jewish communities. And, for example, in areas like Nakab, the Negev in the south, the remaining Bedouin Palestinians were confined to an area that was referred to as the fence, in order for the area that they had been occupying to be freed up for Jewish settlement. And Ilan mentioned the military regime that existed till '66. I also wanted to mention the fact that until today, the Israeli state has a focus or an interest in what it refers to as Judaization of areas like the Negev and the Galilee, areas that have kept a relatively high number of Palestinian citizens compared to other areas of the state, and therefore are a focus for the state's anxiety with regards to the demographic battle in the state's perspective. That discourse of the demographic threat is commonplace amongst Israeli academics, think tanks, politicians, laypersons, the general public. The idea that Palestinians with citizenship are a threat to the state simply by the fact that they are Palestinians. And if you're wanting to see how that works out in practice, then you can remember the fact that the law that currently means that Palestinian citizens, Israeli citizens, can't legally live with their spouse if that spouse is a Palestinian from the West Bank and Gaza. The motivation for that law is not security, but a desire to make sure that Palestinians don't gain citizenship through marriage in the context of the demographic struggle. And then, of course, what happened after 1967 was that the same colonial logic was extended to the West Bank and Gaza, remembering West Bank including East Jerusalem too. And I'm sure many of us are familiar with what's happened since '67 in terms of the creation and consolidation of the colonies, the illegal settlements. Subsequently, that regime has been expanded to include the separation wall, the road network that connects the settlements to each other, various other kind of ways of limiting Palestinian access to territories, such as the creation of areas reserved for the Israeli military to train in, and these sorts of things. And to the extent that by now, in 2012, you have the existence of a de facto one state, a de facto single regime from the river to the sea, where the Israeli state sets policies that discriminate and make a difference on people's lives depending on where they are and what sort of ID they have and what ethnicity they are. I'm going to touch upon as well, just I want to briefly, economic marginalization and the way in which the Israeli state has targeted Palestinian economic, the ability for Palestinians to generate kind of independent economics, not just within the West Bank and Gaza, but also inside 48 area as well. There are tons of statistics to show the levels of inequality between Jewish and Palestinian citizens within 48. Just to give you a couple of examples of these. In 2003, this figure was from close to half of all Palestinian families lived in poverty compared to around 1 in 5 Jewish Israeli families. In 2010, Palestinian citizens accounted for 1/3 of all poor people in Israel. Out of the 30 communities in Israel with the most unemployment, 27 of them are Palestinian communities, and you could go on with this sort of list. Interestingly, actually, just as a kind of side note, although it's important, in the last few years there's been an emphasis by the Israeli state on encouraging economic growth within the Israeli Arab sector, and you have to realize that the reason for this is not a kind of sudden change in heart about some of the fundamental aspects of policy, but because the Israeli government itself realized that the way in which the Palestinian sector had been kept down economically was actually inhibiting the ability of the state as a whole to grow to the extent that was required from an economic point of view, and the context of Israel's entry into the OECD as well. Let me just check how I'm doing on the time. There we go. When it comes to the West Bank and Gaza as well, it's a complete fallacy to think of the ability of an independent Palestinian economy, independent of the Israeli regime and independent of the occupation. That's because there is no practical means for the Palestinians to develop an independent economy. And you can find that even in the reports of publications by radical groups like the World Bank and the IMF, who will be quite clear, even in their own language, they'll be quite clear to say, look, you can pump as much aid as you want into the occupied territories, but there's never going to be a thriving independent economy while Israeli colonization and occupation practices persist. Okay, obviously they didn't say colonization. I'm going to mention as well the fact that when you're talking about the displacement of the Palestinians, you're not just talking about something that happened in history. Okay? It's an ongoing Nakba that didn't finish in 49 or 50 or even 67, but is carrying on today, and it carries on in both Israel proper and inside the occupied territories. And this again relates to what I was mentioning a bit earlier about understanding the nature of Israel's policies in this whole de facto one state. If you took a sample of events that have happened with regards to the displacement of Palestinians over the last few years, you'll notice that very similar things have happened to Palestinians in Naqab, in the south, in the same way that Palestinians in the Jordan Valley or the southern Hebron Hills have been expelled and had their properties demolished too. And in both cases, it's with the same goal in mind, that of furthering or enabling Jewish settlement and making sure that space is cleared for that, and marginalizing or eradicating the presence of the Palestinian communities there too. I just wanted to mention the fact that the reality of that forced displacement is reflected in the language and reports, again, of internationally respected human rights bodies. And this is the language that Amnesty International use. Quote, "The quartet must face the facts on the ground in the occupied West Bank, escalating demolitions and whole villages threatened with forced eviction." Right, then how about these words from the EU Parliament? The EU Parliament called earlier this year for, quote, "immediate end to house demolitions, evictions and forced displacement of Palestinians." Of course, whether that means the EU will then decide to actually make those realities of ongoing human rights abuses a factor in trade relations with Israel remains to be seen. But that is a positive development in the sense of the documentation of these policies by those sorts of bodies. And I wanted to mention, I think, something that maybe has been mentioned before, which was the report by the UN's Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination earlier this year. Very important report, which is, again, recommended for you all to read and download. And they use language like de facto segregation, talking about Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And the sorts of policies that the committee was analyzing in Israel and the occupied territories were severe enough, again, in the language of the committee, to cause them to remind Israel of the prohibition on apartheid. And that was the kind of first time that sort of language had been used by that committee since the days of South African apartheid. So I'm going to round it up there in case there is time for a couple of quick questions. But But just to kind of focus on that last section that I was talking about the ongoing Nakba and the fact that it didn't stop in 1948. And that's something that is important for both our analysis of what's going on, but also as a way of spurring people into action as well, because there's things that haven't happened yet that could be stopped. And we need to be able to look at what's happening there with a clear lens, a clear prism, that the question of Palestine is not just the siege of Gaza, it's not just the settlements in the West Bank, but it's a question of decolonization and democratization and the implementation of all the Palestinian people's historic rights that will bring an end to this ongoing Nakba.
Ben, thanks very much for being so brief and helping us to get to lunch on time, Pierre. And just to remind members of the audience that all the presentations are available online. It gives us a chance to get a very quick question in from Cynthia McKinney.
Thank you, Mr. White, for your designation, I believe I should say, of this ongoing Nakba. Many prominent supporters of Israel here in the United States came together and wrote a document entitled A Clean Break. Do you see the conditions advancing toward Israel being able to make that clean break? And what does that portend for the Palestinian people and world peace if Israel does?
Sure. Do you want to just clarify which kind of aspect of that focus you want me to comment on?
The idea that Israel would be able to act unilaterally in its own interest without regard to the concerns of, say, the United States, which might be a restraint on Israeli adventures around the region and the world.
Well, in terms of whether Israel will be able to exacerbate or even further these sorts of policies without regard for international sanction or restraints, well, it's hard to predict things in the future. I think that question for me makes me think of how the region as a whole is changing and how Israel's ability to act in certain ways, I think, is probably going to be, in some ways, more limited than it has been in the past. But on the other hand, before the massacres of Gaza in 2008, 2009, maybe nobody imagined that something like that would happen. Or before the assault on the Palestinian cities in the West Bank in 2002, perhaps nobody thought that would happen either. So there's probably a good lesson to be learned from history, that one shouldn't be surprised, but prepared for everything.
Thanks. We have some time for another question from the tribunal, if anybody would like to pose a question. Thanks very much, Roger.
I'm not sure this is directly relevant to what Ben has been telling us, but it's something that's been bubbling up in me, so I'd like to say it if I may. And that is in light of...
Can I be so bold as to ask you to speak directly into the microphone?
In light of the testimony that we've heard from the witnesses, Ilan Pape and Peter Hansen and Ben, this morning, that testimony being both elegant, cogent, and compelling testimony, sitting here as we are in New York City, I'm bound to say, and having been told by Peter Hansen how the UN lacks teeth, partially at least because of the US power of veto and so on and so forth, and slowly the evidence builds. It's hard to sit here and ignore the elephant in the room. This elephant being the unfathomable influence in the corridors of power of the Israeli and Jewish lobby, which sits over all these discussions when we sit here and talk to each other about, well, what do we do, what are we to do, and we talk about public opinion and how I'm sitting here thinking that, yes, we, the public, listening to these compelling arguments, must have an opinion, and why is it that it's not being expressed by our political leaders to the UN and in governments around the world. And it has something to do with this elephant to which I refer. That's it.
Thank you. Would you like to comment?
Well, I mean, in my experience and kind of thinking about the difficulty of making our politicians take action, there's a number of different factors involved, one of which is obviously like organized pro-Israel groups, and in the US, in a different way to the UK, that involves both organized Jewish groups as well as Christian Zionist groups, which I believe is going to be a topic addressed later in this session too, in the tribunal. But on the, in addition, those pro-Israel groups find an ear because of the way in which the foreign policies of our governments have a role for Israel, and that kind of they are open to that idea in the first place. I mean, if that makes sense, that it's a combination of economic, military, and imperial interests that mean that there is a space for that lobby to kind of speak to.
Thanks very much. And there are a number of topics coming up this afternoon and tomorrow.
I know.
Role of civil society and the state, etc. So there's no elephant in the room that will survive this couple of days. But I'd like to thank all those who have presented this morning and done so well to help us reach the point here that the timetable set out, 1 p.m. Pierre. So there you are.
So
thank you.
You do it very well. Thank you. Thank you.
My name is Frank Barrett. I'm the coordinator of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine. Israel has committed countless of war crimes, has violated UN resolutions for many years. But the problem is that people sometimes don't see through that. And Israel couldn't do what it's been doing for decades now without the active support of corporations, of UN bodies, of other countries. So we do hope that this session, with the amazing panel, we've got the amazing US committee that has put this in place, the amazing jury panel, the speakers. We do hope, and the audience, of course, we do hope that this is going to help, this is going to reinforce the sort of pro-justice movement in the US, that it's going to empower the pro-justice movement in the US, but also that it's going to put the deciders in front of the action. They won't be able for much longer to actually continue and remain silent in supporting Israel. We see radical changes. We've seen radical changes in the last few years all over the world. And I think the deciders, as we call them, know that their time is coming.